In today's video, I'm going to tell you about 6 different types of watercolor. Wait, what? 6? Yep. Watercolor from a tube, watercolor from a pan, liquid watercolor from a bottle, and a watercolor marker, stick, and pencil. Phew, who knew there were that many? I'm going to start by swatching them out so you can see them side by side on paper, and then I'm going to paint something with all 6. So first up we have the Professional Series watercolor in a tube from Winsor & Newton in Payne's Grey, which is going to be a bit of a theme throughout this video. I mentioned this in my recent video about student versus artist grade watercolor supplies, but Winsor & Newton actually recommend using their tube paint freshly squeezed, opposed to how most people, including myself, use it, which is squeezing it out into a palette, letting it dry, and using it from there almost like pan paint. It's totally fine to use it either way. I have never noticed a difference in performance, but the only thing is it can be easier to control saturation when you're using it from a dry cake, because as you can see, using it fresh from the tube, it is super intense. I think it's good to have paints like this though, ones that pack a lot of punch when it comes to pigment. I'd rather learn to use the color sparingly than have to waste my time painting layer upon layer to get the saturation that I want, and ultimately wasting paint. So just FYI, I'm not going to blend these swatches back and forth to get a nice smooth blend, so there's going to be a few blooms and odd patches. It's more just to see how they would perform top down. Next up is pan watercolor. This is actually my own version of Payne's Grey called Storm from my handmade paint range. Commercial brands will have a much smoother finish to their pans, whereas mine are kind of just filled as high as I can get the paint in there. Not as smooth and perfect as commercial. Some brands of pan watercolor can be quite hard to activate from a pan and a bit tough on your brush, which isn't good, and some don't offer the same kind of payoff as tube paint, but really any good artist grade paint should perform just as well as tube paint. Most brands use the same formula for both, but you know, as I mentioned, Winsor & Newton say they have different formulas. I've never noticed a difference though. Next up we have liquid watercolor, which comes in a bottle. So sometimes they have their own dropper. The newer Ecoline bottles do, but this Ecoline one is an older one and it doesn't. So I don't actually recommend using it the way I'm about to, by dipping my brush straight in, just in case you contaminate it. But I had already started filming this video before I realized I didn't have any pipettes left, so here we are. Liquid watercolors are a dye and they can be much more vibrant than pan or tube colors, and a smooth blend is often easier to achieve, but I find that they can look quite flat. So as you can see with the tube and the pans, there's such a range of values from super dark to super light, whereas the liquid is just kind of like dark and light, not so much variation. So what we are going to look at next is a watercolor marker, and I've got to say it's my absolute favorite brush pen for lettering. So this is the Winsor & Newton watercolor marker in Payne's Grey, and they're not cheap, but I think they're totally worth it for lettering. And they've got 2 tips on them, a bullet tip and a brush tip, and the brush tip is just amazing. So this is actually a really rare time you're going to see me using the brush tip on watercolor paper, because textured paper like cold press is really not good for keeping a brush tip in tip-top shape. So even though, you know, sketching this out on the page you might think, wow, that's going to stain, it lifts surprisingly easy and blends down really nicely. So the pigmentation as well is pretty good, but I guess for me, I've just never really found a way to fit these into my watercolor process, so it's highly likely I'm just going to stick to lettering with them. This is the same Payne's Grey as the tube and as Winsor & Newton's pan watercolor, not that I have that and I'm using it in this, but it's also the same as the next product we're going to use. So these are sticks of watercolor, which are supposed to provide you an effortless transition between drawing and painting. So they're a bit like a crayon, and you can just draw them straight onto paper and activate them from there. You could also use your brush and brush the actual crayon itself and then paint on paper, but I think it's, you know, fine just to use it the way I am, putting it down, swatching it out. It activates pretty well as well. You could also add texture into your work by not swatching over all of it, or by adding the stick or the crayon over the top of a finished piece to add just that little bit of fun texture, because cold press is kind of a rough surface, so it will really bring that out. The cool thing about these, as well as the watercolor markers, is that they play really well with the Winsor & Newton range. So you could get Winsor & Newton tube paint, pan paint, watercolor marker, and these sticks, and they're all going to integrate really well with each other and all play just like watercolor should. Next up is the pencil. I'm just using the Jazzco Studio watercolor pencil in Payne's Grey. So these have the pigment inside the pencil as lead, and much the same way as the marker and the stick, you can just scribble them down directly onto your paper and activate from there. But there are a ton of other ways you can use these as well. Out of all the watercolor types, these are probably like my least favorite for coverage, because there's just a lack of saturation in comparison to the rest, and the time it takes to scribble it down, it just feels like watercolor with extra steps. But I think that they definitely do have their purpose, including sketching things, which I'm a huge fan of using them for now. So basically, if you use a lead pencil and sketch down then paint over the top, it's really hard to get that pencil off or stop it from being visible through your final painting. But if you use a watercolor pencil, it just kind of blends and fades away with the rest of your painting, which is perfect. When I was thinking about what type of painting I could do for this video that would incorporate these 6 different types of watercolor, I thought, hang on a second, what about a doggo? I actually painted this dog recently using just pan watercolor, but something I struggled with was getting some texture around the muzzle, and I thought, hang on a second, maybe the stick or the crayon could be really good for that. And I initially laid it down underneath, but I ended up covering it up and using it as a top layer, which I will show you and talk to later. But before I talk about how I incorporated all those types of watercolor into this, and I promise it will look less like a pig and more like a dog soon, I thought I'd talk about, like, why would you use one type of watercolor over the other? What are the benefits? So in terms of traditional watercolor that gives you all the beautiful characteristics of watercolor, like granulation and the blooms and the beautiful variation in value, that's where pan and tube would definitely come to mind. They demonstrate all the traditional characteristics of watercolor, and I just think they are the most versatile in terms of how you can use them. When it comes to portability, if you're someone that travels a lot and likes to paint on the go, that's where tubes and liquids might not be so good for you. You might lean towards pan, marker, stick and pencils, because there's obviously an element of liquid to there. Maybe you can't take them on the plane, things like that. You could of course squeeze out your tube watercolor and use it in a palette. And when it comes to maybe wanting smooth blends and vibrancy, so maybe you don't want the traditional characteristics of watercolor, maybe you don't want these different patches of light and dark, you don't want any blooms, and you just want a nice flat color, that's when liquid might come in handy for you, and it's very bright as well, meaning you don't need a lot of layers. Perhaps you're into lettering, which I would then recommend. Obviously liquid and the brush marker would come in a lot of handy for that. And maybe you're someone who likes illustration and adding details, so the marker, stick and pencil would be really good for that. In terms of how I use them all in this painting, I started off with the watercolor pencil, sketching out the outline, which as I mentioned is really good because it kind of just like disappears as you paint over it. Then I used the crayon a little bit for the muzzle, but I had to add that over the top so it would actually show up. For most of the color I used just the tube and the pan watercolor, and then I used a tiny bit of liquid on the nose because it looked a bit more black in comparison to these other colors, which suited the nose perfectly. But also I just don't really like liquid watercolors, so I didn't really want to use it too much, but it was nice and saturated for the nostrils. I used the marker for flicking out a couple bits of fur and also some darker details around the eyes. And then I used the pencil again for just a little bit of detail around flicks of fur again, and went over the top of course with the watercolor stick. So I hope that you found this interesting and maybe learned a few different ways that you can use different types of watercolor in your work. And let me know if you've got any questions in the comments below about any of these different types of watercolor. I would love to get back to you. And I definitely had a great time using all 6 of these in my remake of the watercolor dog. It was really interesting to put them all together. I'm not sure that I would use them all in the same painting again, but I can definitely see the benefit of the different types. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it helpful, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Bye.